Hello and welcome to episode 3 of series 2 of Lore Diver. This series is diving into the lore of the Arcane Age, and as I started with a couple weeks ago now, after a whole bunch of stuff happening, we started this series with Netheril. You know, easily the most famous part of the Arcane Age and the Forgotten Realms. So tonight we are carrying on with Netheril. This is going to be part 2 of what's going to be a three-part mini-series in a series about the Arcane Age. So if you're fresh to the series, please check out the first couple of videos and to catch up. Like, not right now, obviously. If you're watching, please continue to watch. Don't stop watching to watch the old ones. And I will also have a link set up here on YouTube for the Arcane Age Primer blog post that I wrote. So you can see the map of the Arcane Age that I've got up there, see the timelines, all that sort of good stuff. Now, before we start, if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. And if you dig what I'm doing, please consider supporting me through Ko-fi or Patreon. Now, let's get into it. So, system and narrative matters. Last Sunday, I tweeted that I had had an epiphany about Netheril that caused me to re-examine my analysis and rewrite the episode. What this boiled down to was that there was a lot of issues that I was identifying and felt stumped by. And they weren't just the result of writers trying to link up a shoddily assembled narrative arc and weld it to, as the Doctor may refer to them as, fixed points in time. So a large component of this appears to come from the era that the game was written. Because, when I first came into this, I was looking at it from the perspective of, 3.5, 4, and now 5th edition. And I was looking at a lot of the stuff and I was like, this seems like, why is any of this happening? What's going on? And then it clicked all of a sudden. I was like, wait, all this formative stuff, all this core material was written during AD&D, during the 2nd edition. And once I recognized that, a whole bunch of the dysfunctional aspects of the culture and how things worked made sense. Not in that they made sense culturally, they never became sensical that way. That's still a mess of maladaptive nonsense. What did start to make sense was why the Arcanists were the way they are and why the magic users of Netheril were so very messed up. And yeah, all this stuff was written in the 1990s. Well, not all of it, sorry. The core of the Netheril setup was written in the 1990s. And it was a case very much of them escalating what had been a very safe, barely described classical lost civilization into something that worked more or less with the mechanics and narrative assumptions of the game. The former had problems, and the latter is a mess for building stable civilizations. So, yeah, wow. Basically, what it is at least in my opinion, Dungeons and Dragons it's a great game. It's a fun game. It has trouble with high magic settings normally because of the way that magic works in it, and especially back in AD&D. This was a big problem, especially given magical item creation. If you've come into the game, in the Wizards era of it, magical item creation, it's a pain. I mean, you lose some experience points. It costs a lot of money in game, but it's not that bad. It used to be horrible. The creation of a magical item required that a permanency spell be cast, and in AD&D days, that meant a 1 point of Constitution loss for the magic user who was casting it. That's a serious issue, because it was a permanent loss. It doesn't come back, and there was no guarantee that it actually worked. That was just the final part of making a magical item that you hoped would work out, and that your loss of a Constitution point would be valuable. And then, depending on the power of the magical item, there's a whole little formula involving the cost of components, and the spells and a bunch of other things that told you, I think you divided it by 10 or something like that, or divided it by 100, and that told you how many days it would take your magic user to recover and be able to use magic again after making an item. And this could be a couple of days for something minor to weeks, if not months, for a major item. So things like creating a mythalar and then cutting the top off a mountain, like all the things I talked about last episode to create a floating city. Technically, under second edition rules, that would like lay out that wizard for months. Just months of them just lying there. Can't cast spells, can't do anything. It had to be like absolute rest. So, ugh, it's just. So suddenly seeing that, I was like, okay, I now understand why there's such a broken operation. Like they're trying to bend super high magic around those mechanics, and so they came up with sort of a workaround for it. They brought in basically magic technology. The designers knew they weren't going to be allowed to break the system, so they used mythalars and quasi magical items as a workaround. And then brought forward the optional spell point system as a further way to differentiate the era. Like it wasn't perfect, but it sort of got the ball rolling and explained why the wizards seemed to be like so excited about getting these mythalars and other things up and running, is because in effect it let them circumvent the mechanics of the game that they were being written for. And I know that sounds kind of meta, but that's the gist of it that I got. And the other part was the strong narrative assumption that all wizards, regardless of their alignment, are seeking power. Like this is a narrative thread. You see it woven through dozens of NPCs back in the day, and implied that the way wizards and implied in the way that wizards advanced as player characters, that you constantly wanted power, and it always. The descriptions of wizards, they were always loners. They were always by themselves. Like they lived alone in their wizard tower. They seldom partook in society. All that sort of stuff. That was very normal back then. It wasn't until sort of partway through the 90s, and then of course, as we got into the Wizards era, that we see wizards being sociable in games. They're not just weird hermits that live in weird smelling towers out in the middle of nowhere. So they embraced this whole hog, and what that meant sort of for the design of the place was that you had a whole bunch of wizards all independently seeking power, more or less tearing the society they were from apart in their quest for power. And yeah, it just sort of, I had to stop and rethink a bunch of things approaching it. So that takes us very neatly into the peoples of Netheril. I talked about this briefly last episode about the power dynamic, high and low Netheril, all that sort of stuff. So we're going to get a little bit deeper into that now. So the Arcanists are the very top of the pile. They are indisputably dominant, to the point where they effectively know no opposition. Like people, when they encounter people who are against them, it's a surprise to them. And this has bred a very toxic combination of paranoia, hubris, and complacency into them. On one hand, they are, they're paranoid about others stealing their magic, stealing their work, that others are going to get ahead of them. They have immense amounts of hubris, which is seen in that bizarre philosophy of theirs that gods aren't actually gods, they're just wizards that found ultimate magic. And that they can achieve the same thing if they just find the same ultimate magic, whatever that is. And then complacency. They literally are surprised every time they're challenged. Like they're just so used to getting their way and so used to nothing being able to stand in their way that when they run into actual opposition, or when they run into a group of like non-magic users who completely mop the floor with them in some way, shape, or form, they're just boggled by this. They're sort of like, they're completely geared up to deal with, high magic threats, dragons, all sorts of stuff like that. But it's like, seriously, at one point in the material I'm reading, a bunch of very non-magical thieves sneak in and steal one set of the Nether Scrolls. Just get in. Like they use a little bit of magic to get in, but functionally do everything the old-fashioned way and walk out. let's see, I got a question here. I wonder if this hierarchy was borrowed for the Red Wizards of Thay. I think, given the publishing sequence, that they took the ideas from the Red Wizards of Thay and put those onto Netheril. And I say that because Netheril in first edition was like 2 or 3 sentences describing it as a super powerful lost magical civilization. And there was very little else about it. You know, they had magic, all that sort of jazz. But they had an entire book about the Red Wizards of Thay. It was like the only really significant development for that part of Faerun in that edition. And so they sort of laid out this horrifying magocracy? 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 I'm not sure how that's pronounced. Anyways, they laid that out in the dreams of Red Wizards. And I think